Rome was dying. Across Italy, Roman armies were vanishing. Entire legions wiped out in a single afternoon. At Cannae, nearly 70,000 soldiers fell, the worst military disaster Rome had ever suffered. The man responsible was a commander unlike any Rome had faced before, Hannibal Barca, a general so brilliant that he marched an army across the Alps with war elephants, and then spent 16 years destroying Rome's legions on their own soil. Battle after battle, Rome bled. Fear spread through the Republic. Many believed the war was already lost. But in the middle of this catastrophe, a young Roman officer began to think differently. He studied Hannibal. He learned from him. And then he made a decision that shocked Rome itself. He would not chase Hannibal across Italy. He would strike the enemy where they least expected it, straight at Carthage. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. History would remember him as Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal. But to understand how he did it, we must first return to the moment when Rome stood closest to collapse. Rome was not supposed to fear anyone. For generations, the Republic had grown stronger with every war. Its armies were disciplined, its allies were loyal. Its leaders believed that no enemy could truly threaten Rome on Italian soil. Then Hannibal arrived, and suddenly, everything Rome believed about itself began to break. In 218 BC, the war between Rome and Carthage entered a new and terrifying phase. Carthage had already been a rival power for years, but this time the conflict would become something far more personal, far more brutal, and far more dangerous. Because Hannibal Barca was not planning to fight Rome at sea. He was coming for Italy itself. What he did next seemed impossible. He led an army from Spain, across southern Gaul, and then over the Alps, one of the harshest mountain ranges in the ancient world. He brought infantry, cavalry, and even war elephants through snow, ice, and cliffs that should have killed them all. Many men did die on that journey, but enough survived. And when Hannibal descended into Italy, he did not arrive as a raider. He arrived as a nightmare. Rome reacted the way Rome always had. It sent army after army to crush the invader quickly, and army after army was destroyed. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured Roman forces into freezing water, exhausted them, and then shattered them with a perfectly timed ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped an entire Roman army in thick morning fog and slaughtered them before they could even properly form for battle. These were not ordinary defeats. These were humiliations. Rome was not simply losing. Rome was being outthought, outmaneuvered, outclassed. And then came Cannae. If Trebia was a warning and Trasimene a shock, then Cannae was pure horror. In 216 BC, Rome gathered one of the largest armies it had ever assembled. Tens of thousands of soldiers marched out with one purpose: to crush Hannibal through sheer force. On paper, it made sense. Rome had numbers. Rome had manpower. Rome had determination. But Hannibal had something far more dangerous. He understood exactly how Romans thought. He knew their pride. He knew their habits. And at Cannae, he used that knowledge to build a trap so devastating that military historians still study it more than 2,000 years later. The Roman army pushed into the centre, believing victory was close. But that centre was bending on purpose. Slowly, deliberately, Hannibal drew the Romans inward. Then his forces closed around them from the sides. And finally, from behind. What followed was not a battle. It was an annihilation. Roman soldiers were packed so tightly that many could barely raise their weapons. They were crushed together, cut down in waves, unable to escape, unable to breathe, unable to survive. By the end of the day, perhaps 50 to 70,000 Romans were dead. In a single battle, it was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. The scale of the defeat was almost beyond belief. Noblemen died, senior officers died, consuls died, entire bloodlines disappeared on that field. Rome had lost not just men, but confidence. And for the first time in a very long time, the Republic looked mortal. The panic spread quickly. Across Italy, Rome's allies began to hesitate. Some defected. Some waited. Some started to wonder whether Hannibal, not Rome, was now the stronger power. That may have been the most dangerous part of all. Because wars are not won by steel alone. They are won by belief. And after Cannae, belief in Rome was collapsing. In the Senate, fear replaced certainty. In the streets, grief replaced pride. And on the battlefield, one truth had become impossible to deny. No Roman commander yet had found an answer to Hannibal. He was faster, smarter, bolder. He turned Roman strength into Roman weakness. Every time they tried to destroy him, he destroyed them instead. This was the world into which a young Roman nobleman was coming of age. A world of defeat, a world of fear, a world where Rome's greatest enemy seemed unstoppable. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was still young, too young in the eyes of many, to carry the future of a dying republic. But what made Scipio dangerous was not his age. It was the way he looked at the war. Where others saw only terror, he saw patterns. Where others wanted revenge, he wanted understanding. And where others were desperate to stop Hannibal by force, Scipio began to realize that defeating a man like Hannibal would require something more difficult. You would have to think like him. That idea would change everything. Because Rome did not merely need another general. It needed someone who could learn from disaster without being broken by it. Someone who could stare at Rome's darkest hour and still imagine victory. And that man was beginning to emerge. Rome had survived Cannae. But survival was not victory. Hannibal was still in Italy. Roman armies were still cautious, wounded, and afraid. And across the western Mediterranean, Carthage still held one of its greatest sources of strength. Hispania, modern Spain, was more than distant territory. It was the foundation of Carthaginian power in the west. Its silver mines funded the war. Its cities supplied men, weapons, and food. And from there, Hannibal's family had built the influence that made his invasion of Italy possible. If Rome wanted to break Carthage, it could not look only at Hannibal. It had to strike the system behind him. That was the opportunity Scipio saw. It was also the risk. In 211 BC, Rome suffered yet another blow in Spain when Scipio's father and uncle were both killed in the campaign there. For many Romans, Hispania had become a graveyard for ambition, a distant front, a dangerous command, a place where reputations went to die. And that was exactly where the young Scipio stepped forward. He was still remarkably young for such responsibility. Too young, many thought, to lead an army in one of the most important theatres of the war. But Rome was short of options. And Scipio possessed something no one could ignore. Confidence. Not reckless confidence. Not empty pride. But the calm self-belief of a man who had already decided what kind of commander he intended to be. When he arrived in Hispania, he did not behave like a general trapped in a defensive war. He moved quickly. He gathered intelligence. He studied the terrain, the loyalties of local tribes, and the habits of the Carthaginian commanders facing him. He understood that war was not only won with steel, it was won with timing, with surprise, with perception, and then he chose his target. New Carthage, the great Carthaginian stronghold in Spain. a wealthy port city, a military base, a treasury, a symbol. To attack it directly was audacious. To capture it quickly seemed almost impossible. But Scipio understood something crucial. The city's strength made it complacent. Its defenders believed distance and geography would protect them. Scipio intended to prove them wrong. He marched fast. He struck before the enemy could fully react. And when the assault began, he pressed from the front with all the force the defenders expected. But that was only part of the plan. Scipio had learned that the lagoon beside the city grew shallow at low tide. At the right moment, when the defenders were fixed on the main attack, Roman troops moved through the water, crossed ground, thought impassable, and attacked where no one was prepared to stop them. It was not brute force that took New Carthage. It was intelligence, speed, and nerve. The city fell, and with it, Rome gained far more than a battlefield success. It seized supplies, weapons, treasure, hostages, and, perhaps most importantly, momentum. Suddenly, this young commander no longer looked like an experiment. He looked like a revelation. But Scipio's victory was not defined by conquest alone. It was defined by what followed. He treated captives with restraint. He showed respect where other commanders might have chosen cruelty. And in a land where loyalty could shift quickly, that mattered. Scipio was not only defeating Carthage's armies, he was weakening Carthage's influence. Tribe by tribe, city by city, confidence was beginning to change sides. That was the deeper power of his campaign. He was not merely winning battles. He was reshaping the political landscape around them. For Rome, this was something new. A commander who could fight boldly without losing control. Who could move fast without becoming careless? Who could inspire allies as effectively as he struck enemies? In Hannibal, Rome had found an opponent who thought beyond the battlefield. Now, in Scipio, it was beginning to produce one of its own. Hispania did not make him famous in a single day. But it made one thing unmistakably clear. This was no ordinary Roman nobleman wearing armor for glory. This was a strategist, a commander who could see what others missed. And with every victory in Spain, Scipio moved closer to the role history had been preparing for him. Because defeating Carthage in Spain was never going to be the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Victory in Hispania changed the way Rome looked at Scipio. He was no longer simply the young nobleman who had stepped forward when others hesitated. He was now a proven commander, a man who could win, a man who could think, and, perhaps most importantly, a man who could change the direction of a war. But Scipio understood something that many in Rome still did not. Winning in Spain was not enough. Yes, Carthage had been weakened. Yes, Roman confidence had begun to recover. But Hannibal was still alive, still undefeated in the imagination of much of the ancient world. Still in Italy. As long as Hannibal remained there, the war could never truly feel won. Rome could survive him. It could contain him. But it could not breathe freely while his shadow still hung over the Republic. Most Roman leaders believed the answer was patience. Contain Hannibal. Avoid disaster. Wear him down over time. It was cautious, understandable, and, in its own way, sensible. But Scipio was not looking for a safe war. He was looking for a decisive one. He had studied Carthage closely enough to see what others missed. Hannibal's brilliance had carried the war into Italy, but even great commanders depend on a system behind them. Money, supplies, political support, allies. If that system could be threatened at its source, then even Hannibal could be forced to move. And so Scipio began to imagine a strategy so bold that many Romans considered it reckless. He would invade Africa. not chase Hannibal across Italy, not fight the same exhausting war year after year. He would carry the war directly to the homeland of Carthage itself. It was a stunning proposal. For some, it sounded visionary. For others, absurd. Rome had spent years bleeding under Hannibal's attacks. And now this young commander wanted to send an army across the sea and strike at the enemy's heart. The Senate was divided. Some admired Scipio's daring. Others distrusted it. They saw ambition, danger, uncertainty, and perhaps something even more unsettling. They saw a man beginning to think beyond the habits of Rome. Scipio, however, was not driven by theatre. This was not boldness for its own sake. It was strategy. If Carthage itself came under direct threat, its leaders would face a terrible choice: leave Hannibal in Italy and watch Africa burn, or recall their greatest general home. That was the pressure point. That was the real target. Not merely territory, not merely battle, but decision. Scipio understood that the finest victories are sometimes won before swords ever meet. Still, vision alone was not enough. If he was going to take the war into Africa, he needed more than Roman courage. He needed allies. And among the most important was Massinissa, the Numidian prince. Numidia's cavalry was among the finest in the ancient world. Fast, disciplined, and devastating in open battle. To win Massinissa was to gain not just a friend, but a weapon Hannibal himself would have respected. Scipio proved as skilled in diplomacy as he was in war. He built trust. He recognized opportunity. He understood that alliances, properly chosen, could transform the balance of power more quickly than armies alone. That may have been one of his greatest strengths. He did not think of war as a series of isolated battles. He thought in systems, in momentum, in pressure, in timing, and slowly the impossible began to take shape. Scipio crossed into Africa. The invasion itself sent a shock through the Mediterranean. For years, Rome had been reacting to Hannibal. Now, suddenly, Carthage was reacting to Rome. The balance of fear had begun to shift. In Africa, Scipio moved with the same qualities that had defined him in Spain: speed, discipline, calculation. He did not waste momentum. He struck hard, won key engagements, and made Carthage feel vulnerable on its own soil. That was the moment the deeper logic of his strategy revealed itself. Carthage could no longer treat the war as something happening elsewhere. The danger was now at its gates. And just as Scipio intended, the pressure became unbearable. Hannibal was recalled from Italy. After more than a decade of campaigning on Roman soil, the invader who had haunted the Republic was finally forced to go home. It was a turning point of enormous significance. Not because the war was over, but because, for the first time, Scipio had succeeded in doing what no Roman commander before him had managed. He had forced Hannibal to respond. He had seized control of the war's direction. Now the path was clear. Two of the greatest military minds of the ancient world were moving toward the same battlefield. Not in Italy, not in Spain, but in Africa. And there, at last, history would demand an answer. At last, the war had come to the place Scipio always intended. Africa, not Rome's fields, not the mountain passes of Italy, not the distant provinces of Spain, but the homeland of Carthage itself. And with that shift, the entire logic of the war had changed. For years, Hannibal had been the force that moved first, the commander who dictated the tempo, the man who chose the ground, shaped the battle, and forced Rome to react. Now, for the first time, that power had been taken from him. He was no longer the invader deep in enemy territory. He was the defender, returning home to save his own city. That alone was a victory for Scipio. But it was not enough. If this war was to end, it would end here, in one final confrontation. In 202 BC, near the town of Zama, two of the greatest commanders of the ancient world prepared to face one another. Scipio Africanus, Hannibal Barca. For anyone alive at the time, the significance of that meeting would have been impossible to miss. These were not simply generals. They were symbols. Hannibal was the terror of Rome, the architect of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, a commander whose very name had become synonymous with disaster. Scipio was something different. Not fear, but answer. Not destruction, but recovery. The man Rome had produced when all its old certainties had failed. And now, at last, they would meet in open battle. There is something almost mythic about that moment. Not because history became legend, but because two minds who had shaped an age were finally forced into direct comparison. Hannibal brought with him what remained of his experience, his veterans, and one weapon that could still disrupt a Roman army before the real fighting even began. War elephants. For any commander, elephants posed a terrifying problem. They were enormous, loud, unpredictable, and capable of smashing through infantry lines before discipline could recover. Against a less imaginative opponent, they might have broken the battle before it properly started. But Scipio had not come to Zama to be surprised. He had studied too much, prepared too carefully, and understood too well that a battle is often decided by whether a commander solves the enemy's first question. Scipio's answer was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of placing his infantry in one dense, continuous line, he arranged them with clear lanes running between the units. To the eye, the Roman formation still looked strong, but hidden inside it was a trap of space and order. When the elephants charged, they did what they had always been meant to do. They rushed forward with terrible force. Dust rose. Men shouted. The ground shook. But instead of smashing into a solid wall of Roman infantry, many of the animals found themselves driven into those open lanes. There, their momentum was blunted, their direction controlled. Roman soldiers shouted, sounded horns, and struck at them from the sides. The charge lost shape. Then it lost fear. And once elephants panic, they become dangerous to everyone. Some turned away. Some crashed into confusion. Some drove back toward Carthaginian lines, spreading disorder where Hannibal most needed control. It was the first great psychological victory of the battle. Scipio had not merely endured Hannibal's opening move. He had neutralized it. Then the battle deepened. The infantry came together. Steel met steel. Roman discipline against Carthaginian endurance. Dust and sunlight mixed above the field. Standards swayed. Lines bent, recovered, and pressed again. This was no chaotic ambush, no sudden trap in fog or river water. This was a deliberate test of command, a contest between preparation and adaptation. And in that contest, another factor would prove decisive. Massinissa, Scipio's alliance with the Numidian king, now revealed its full value. Numidian cavalry, fast and agile, helped drive off the opposing horsemen from the field. For a time, they vanished into the distance in pursuit, and in that disappearance lay the battle's suspense. Because while the infantry struggled in brutal deadlock, the question remained: who would return first and when? This is what made Zama so dramatic. It was not won in a single moment. It was built through layers of control. Scipio had contained the elephants, held the line, managed the pressure, and now he waited for the shape of the battle to complete itself. At the critical moment, it did. the cavalry returned. Massinissa and the Roman horse rode back onto the field and struck Hannibal's army from behind. It was the kind of blow Hannibal himself had once delivered to Rome at Cannae. Now the pattern had been reversed. Carthaginian troops, already locked in hard fighting to their front, suddenly found destruction closing from the rear. The line broke. Then it collapsed. And with that collapse, the war was decided. Hannibal was defeated, not outmaneuvered by chance, not broken by numbers alone, but beaten by a commander who had learned, adapted, and risen high enough to meet him as an equal. That may be the deepest meaning of Zama. Rome did not win because Hannibal ceased to be great. It won because Scipio became great enough to defeat greatness. For years, Hannibal had represented the limits of Roman power. At Zama, Scipio shattered those limits. He proved that Rome could do more than survive genius. It could answer it. And in answering it, he changed history. Because after Zama, Carthage would never again threaten Rome in the same way. The balance of the Mediterranean had tilted. The age of fear was ending. The age of Roman dominance was beginning. And at the center of that turning point stood one man, calm, patient, dangerously intelligent, Scipio Africanus. The commander who did what no one else had done. He defeated Hannibal. Zama ended the war, but it did not end the story. For Rome, the victory was enormous. Carthage was broken, its power shattered, its ambitions cut down before they could rise again. The city that had once sent Hannibal across the Alps would never again stand before Rome in quite the same way. And for the Republic, that meant more than peace. It meant transformation. The balance of the Mediterranean had changed. Rome was no longer merely surviving among rivals. It was becoming the dominant power of the ancient world. And at the center of that transformation stood the man who had made it possible, Scipio. After Zama, he was given the name by which history still remembers him, Africanus. It was more than an honor. It was a declaration. Rome was not simply rewarding a general. It was marking the man who had carried Roman power into Africa, broken Carthage at its source, and defeated the most feared commander of the age. That kind of victory changes how a man is seen, but it also changes the world around him. To the people of Rome, Scipio was a hero, a savior, the commander who had done what no one else could do. He had met Hannibal not with panic, nor with blind courage, but with patience, preparation, and intelligence. He had answered disaster with discipline, and in doing so, he gave Rome back something it had nearly lost forever: confidence. That may have been his greatest gift to the Republic. Not only victory, but belief. Yet history is rarely generous for long, especially in Rome. The Republic admired greatness, but it also feared it. A man who became too successful, too admired, too independent, could quickly become a threat in the eyes of political rivals. And Scipio, by now, was no ordinary public figure. His name carried prestige. His victories carried influence. His reputation was large enough to inspire loyalty beyond office and law. That made him vulnerable. The same city that had once looked to him for salvation began, in time, to turn restless. Questions were raised. Accusations followed. Political enemies circled him not because he had failed, but because he had risen too high. This was one of Rome's deepest contradictions. It could create extraordinary men in moments of crisis, then grow uneasy once they had become extraordinary. Scipio found himself drawn into disputes, suspicion, and public attacks that had little to do with the battlefield and everything to do with power. For a man shaped by war, strategy, and purpose, this kind of struggle must have felt especially bitter. He had defeated Hannibal. He had changed the fate of Rome. And yet, Rome itself could not remain simple in victory. In the end, Scipio withdrew from public life. There is something deeply human in that final turn. The conqueror of Carthage did not end his days wrapped in endless applause. He stepped away, not defeated in war, but wearied by politics. And that contrast tells us something important about his legacy. Scipio was not great because his life became perfect after triumph. He was great because, at the most dangerous moment in Rome's history, he saw further than the men around him. He understood that strength without imagination would fail, that courage without thought would bleed a nation dry, and that even the most terrifying enemy can be defeated if you are willing to change the shape of the struggle itself. That is why Scipio Africanus still matters, not only as a Roman hero, not only as the man who defeated Hannibal, but as a rare kind of leader, one who understood that the greatest victories are never merely tactical. They are psychological, political, civilizational. He won at Zama, but what he truly secured was something larger. Rome's future. After him, the Republic would continue to rise. Its armies would march farther. Its influence would spread wider. Its confidence would harden into destiny. And behind that long ascent stood the memory of one decisive truth. When Rome came closest to ruin, one man changed everything. Scipio Africanus, the young commander who became Rome's answer to Hannibal, the strategist who turned survival into dominance, and the man whose greatest victory still echoes across history. Scipio Africanus did more than win a battle. He changed the fate of Rome. At the moment when the Republic stood closest to collapse, he proved that courage alone was not enough, that true victory belongs to the commander who can think more clearly, move more boldly, and reshape the war itself. That is why his name still endures. Not simply as the man who defeated Hannibal, but as the strategist who turned fear into dominance. If you enjoy stories of legendary commanders, decisive battles, and the moments that changed history forever, subscribe to the channel. Because history is not only the story of empires, it is the story of the rare individuals who changed their destiny and ours. Thanks for watching.